and welcome to another exciting edition of Anatomy and Physiology with Mr. Zabel. In today's lesson, what we're going to be looking at is the respiratory system. And so when we look at the respiratory system, we can see that it goes along with our circulatory system. In fact, we need the respiratory system in order to bring in oxygenated blood, which we then can circulate through our circulatory system. So again, we're going to see how the respiratory system is very important and needs to function in order to have our circulatory system work and function properly. When we look at the respiratory system, we can see that it is a vital and important body system to learn and understand how it works. When we look at respiration, again, the process of ventilation, we can see that we are basically going to be exchanging gases. And so that's a major function when we look at the respiratory system. And the two gases that we're going to be exchanging is oxygen and CO2. And so we've kind of talked about this when we looked at the circulatory system, talking about bringing in oxygenated blood. So you breathe in oxygen, it's then going to go through your circulatory system, and then eventually it will go to the tissues that need that oxygen. And then we're also going to be producing this byproduct, this waste product of CO2. Again, we want to get rid of the CO2, so it's eventually going to have to go through the circulatory system until it reaches our lungs, and then we can exhale it out. And so it's very important that we understand this gas exchange that's going to be occurring here in our capillaries inside of our lung tissue. So that is, again, our major function of the respiratory system. Another function of the respiratory system is to balance our pH. Again, when we look at this, if you increase your CO2 levels by holding your breath, you're going to become more acidic. And we talked about this as being respiratory acidosis. And then vice versa, we could be respiratory alkalosis, where, again, you hyperventilate and you decrease the amount of CO2 in the blood. It's also going to be important when we have voice production. The way I talk is going to be directly involved with your vocal cords, again, which are going to be located right about here in this region. But again, making voice production is going to be a major function of our respiratory system. Olfaction, or smelling, is another important respiratory function. Again, being able to smell with your nose. Again, this is one pathway in which we can bring in air, and again, we can bring in our sense of smell this way too. And then finally, we have innate immunity. Again, when we talk about immunity, we can see that we have this respiratory tract, and again, bacteria, different viruses have to go through this respiratory tract in order to get into the body. So it's going to help with our immunity. When we look at your respiratory system, we can see it's divided up into two major divisions. We have what's called your upper respiratory tract and your lower respiratory tract. And so if you've ever gone to the hospital, perhaps you went in because you had some kind of cold, and maybe they said it was an upper respiratory tract infection. Or perhaps it was more something like bronchitis, which is more in your lungs, and again, they said that was a lower respiratory tract infection. But again, when we look at these divisions, again, when we look at, say, your upper respiratory tract, again, this is going to be in the most superior region. And so that's going to include your nose, your nasal cavity, and your pharynx. If we go to your lower respiratory tract, again, that's going to be in this region of your body. Again, it's more inferior, and so that's going to be your larynx, your trachea, your bronchus, and your lungs. Again, that's going to be made up of your lower respiratory tract. And so what we're going to do in this podcast is today we're going to be looking at specifically the anatomy. And so we're basically going to travel through your respiratory system, starting up here with your nostril and nasal cavity, working all the way through your pharynx to your trachea, and then eventually to your lungs. But again, what we're going to be looking at is basically just the anatomy today. When we look at your respiratory system, there's two ways in which we can bring foreign substances into your body. And again, when we look at your foreign substance, this might be as simple as oxygen entering your body or CO2 leaving your body. So again, there's two ways in which substances can enter and leave the body. One is through the nose. Okay, so when you breathe in through your nose, again, that's one way in which we can bring in particles to the inside of our body. The other way is through your mouth. So you can breathe stuff in, and vice versa. You can also have stuff from the inside of your body escape through these passages as well. So, and you can breathe out. But again, when we look at this, the main structure we're going to look at first is looking at your nose. And so your nose is going to be this visible structure that protrudes outside of your face. And again, when we look at it, it's mostly going to be composed up of cartilage. And so that's why it's flexible and you can move it back and forth. What we're going to see is once you go through your nares, so your nostrils, okay, if we look at a cross section down here, again, this is one nostril, so this is a nare. We can go through that, and then you get into this big space. This is called your nasal cavity. And again, your nasal cavity will go from your nare all the way to the back where it enters into your pharynx. When we look at the inside of your nasal cavity, you're going to see these bony ridges. These are going to be your concave. And there are three types of concave we can have: a superior concave, middle concave, and inferior concave. When we look at these concave, basically what it's going to be involved in is warming up the air. So it's going to basically humidify the air. So when you take in cold air, it's going to be heated up. And it's going to be lined with all these blood vessels. So again, more blood will be circulating in these areas. And that's why you typically see bloody noses from the nose, because you are highly, have a lot of blood vessels that are going to be highly innervating this location. And then finally, if we go all the way to the back, this opening is your corona, and it opens up into the pharynx. Also, when we look at your nose, keep in mind that you have two nostrils, and you have this bone in the middle. Okay, this bone right here that should be connecting, again, the superior part to the inferior part of your nasal cavity, that is called your nasal septum. And it's just going to be this partition that divides it into a right and left side of your nasal cavity. And again, each nair will be located on each side of it. And if you were to damage this or kind of have it crooked or bent, what can result is called the deviated septum. So again, this is your septum, and it's just deviated, so it is then pushed more to the right or to the left. And again, you can see this if you were to, say, get punched in the nose, or if like hockey players might damage their nose, and they would have a deviated septum. Also, I want you to know kind of is when we look at the structures that you have what's called the hard palate. And the hard palate is going to form the floor of the nasal cavity. So if you were to put your tongue on the top of your hard palate, again, that's going to be the kind of the floor of your nasal cavity. And we'll take a look at that here in this next slide. So if we move back further from your nasal cavity, the next big passageway that we're going to come in contact is your pharynx. And so when you think of your pharynx is actually what we call your throat. And this is going to be the common passageway for your respiratory system to travel along, and then also your digestive system. And so again, we're going to find out that actually food and air are going to both go down this passageway on your pharynx. And so when we look at the function of your pharynx, it's really important for swallowing. And so we're going to have contraction of the pharynx, and as we contract it, then you are going to swallow. So again, when you swallow, that's going to be a contraction of this pharynx. So if we take a look at your pharynx, we can see that it's broken down into three major divisions. And they're pretty easy to understand if we know the prefix going into it. And so the very first one that we have is called your narrow pharynx. And so if we bring in air through our nose, it will then travel back to our nasopharynx. And again, it's going to be depicted in red here. If we bring in air through our mouth, again through our oral cavity, this is going to be called then our oral pharynx. And again, it's going to be simulated here with our purple color. And then finally, if we go further down past the nasopharynx and the oral pharynx, you get into what's called your laryngopharynx. And again, this is eventually going to get into our larynx. And so what I want you to look at here is look at your oral pharynx. You have your hard palate right here. If you were to go back even further, you have your soft palate. Again, this is kind of the mushy part. You can kind of take your tongue across your hard palate and then move it back even further, and then it gets kind of soft. At the very tip of this, at the very end of it, the extension is going to be your uvula. And so that's your hangy ball, which you have probably seen before. If you look back there, you would see this uvula. And again, that's going to be important with our gag reflex. And so what happens is when we swallow, again, what's going to happen is you're going to swallow, have substances go through the back of the throat, and then as it does that, this gets pushed up, your soft palate gets pushed up, so then it doesn't have that food or drink come back up through your nose. Occasionally, if you're laughing very hard, that's exactly what will happen, is you laugh and this doesn't close properly, so food actually goes back through and then comes out your nasal cavity, and then out through your nares. So if we go further down our respiratory tract and we pass our pharynx, we eventually reach our larynx. And so your larynx is going to be kind of this big box, this big enlargement at the top of your trachea. So again, you can see your trachea is here. This big kind of box, our vocal cords, our voice box, this is going to be our larynx. And so when we look at your larynx, you're going to see that it's going to be mostly composed of cartilage. And again, it's going to house our vocal cords. It's going to be considered our Adam's apples. Again, if you are a male, you can feel this big structure that's going to protrude out. And again, if you swallow, you can kind of feel it go up and down. But again, we're going to find out that it's mostly composed of cartilage. And again, we will talk about the vocal cords, which will be located in here. And again, I want you to take a look here, but you can see your epiglottis. Your epiglottis is going to be the piece that is going to basically cover this windpipe, and so it's going to cover your trachea. So then when you are eating, you want to make sure this epiglottis closes over this larynx, so then it doesn't actually have food go down into your trachea and then eventually into your lungs. So if you take a look inside of your larynx and you were to kind of take an aerial shot of it, basically what you would see is you would see these vocal cords. And again, when we look at your vocal cords, there are two types. You have vestibular folds or false vocal cords. And then we also have your true vocal cords or vocal folds. And so if you take a look here, this white structure right here, this is representing your true vocal cords. And again, you'd see it over here as well. And basically what's going to happen is these are going to open and close. You're also going to have on the sides, this will be your false vocal cords, kind of this pinkish material here, but that's going to be your false vocal cords that will aid in helping your true vocal cords open and close. So if we put our your vocal cords, your true ones, together closer, you're going to have higher pitched voice. And if you pull them farther apart, they will be a deeper sounding voice. But again, we can adjust this by putting air through these vocal cords and then moving these vocal cords back and forth. We can adjust the pitch and the sound that's coming out. So two other terms that I want you to be aware of when we look at your larynx and the structures that are going to be associated with it is your glottis and epiglottis. Your glottis is going to be, again, if we look at your vocal cords down here, your true vocal cords, if we move them apart, so again, we take these ones and we spread them apart, we have kind of this triangular shape that will go down into our trachea. This triangular shape is called our glottis. If we take a look at this flap on the outside, which is this piece, that's going to be our epiglottis. And again, this epiglottis is going to close over that opening, so then if we do have food that does eventually we swallow it, we don't want to make it go down into our trachea, so this epiglottis will cover that hole to prevent that food from going down. However, if you are laughing, this kind of goes and kind of goes back and forth and vibrates, and you can see as it does that, food can slip in and then go down your trachea, and then that's usually what happens when you start to cough everything up because you get some particles that have gone down into your lungs. So if we travel further down our respiratory tract, we'll eventually pass our larynx through our vocal cords, and we'll eventually reach our long tube called our trachea. And so this trachea, or commonly known as the windpipe, is going to be this tube that's going to allow air to travel from our lungs. And again, we can travel air from the outside environment to our lungs or from the lungs to the outside environment. And when we look at the trachea, you're going to see that it's going to be kind of this ribbed feeling, so you can kind of feel it here, and you're going to feel all these little tiny C-shaped cartilages along the side of it. And again, the C-shaped cartilages are going to actually help us with support and protection. And you'll notice it's only going to be on the anterior side, the front side of the trachea. We won't have it on the back side because we've got to think about it. When you are eating food, directly behind your trachea is going to be your esophagus. And so food is going to travel down behind it, and we don't want to have food get lodged or stuck behind it. So again, this is why we only have the C-shaped cartilages in the front. We also have it innervated by the vagus nerve, which will help with the coughing reflex. So again, if some particle gets lodged into the trachea, we can cough it and expel it out. And again, that's due to the vagus nerve. It's also going to have smooth muscles that will help contract the diameter. So if we contract it, it will decrease the diameter and make it smaller. If we travel then through our trachea, we eventually get this point, again, where we have to take a right or a left, and this is going to correspond with our left lung and our right lung. But in order to get into the lungs, we have to go through these bronchi. And again, these bronchi are going to basically branch off and then go into our lung tissue. Again, the part that I want you to know is where we have this split. This is called our hilum. So again, you have your trachea, reaches our hilum, and then it branches off into your left primary bronchus and then your right primary bronchus. So after our trachea, again, you reach this hilum, and then you have to break off into all these branches. So again, we go through your primary bronchus. Again, you can have your left and your right primary bronchus, and then from there it breaks off into your secondary bronchi, your tertiary bronchi, your bronchioles, and then eventually it's going to break off into your alveolar duct and then your alveoli. From the bronchus, we then eventually go to our lungs, which is the major organ involved in respiration. Again, if we take a look at your lungs, again, you can see it's kind of this cone shape, and basically it's going to be resting on this big muscle down below, which is your diaphragm. And again, it's going to be located right here on your body. And so again, this diagram is going to be moving up and down, and we'll talk more about how you actually take in air and how this diaphragm works. But again, when we look at the anatomy of your lungs, you can see that we're going to have different lobes depending on which side we're looking at. And so again, we have, if we look at, say, your left lung, you'll basically see that you have two lobes. You are going to have a superior lobe and an inferior lobe. Whereas if we have the right lobe over here, we're going to see that it has three divisions or three lobes to it. A superior lobe, a middle lobe, and an inferior lobe. But again, make sure you know the differences between the right and the left lung, again, and the lobes that will be different and associated with them. And so once we reach our final destination in terms of our respiratory system, we eventually get to the lung tissue and we see these clusters of alveoli. Again, alveoli are just going to be very tiny, small air sacs that are going to have a whole bunch of capillaries around them. And again, this is going to be very important because gas exchange will take place here. And so that's why we have capillaries innervating them. But again, when we look at it, alveoli is just one single tiny air sac. When we look at an alveolar duct, it's going to be a cluster of alveoli. So again, this entire structure right here would represent an alveolar duct. Just one individual one would represent an alveoli. And so if we take a look at the pathway, again, once we get through our trachea, your trachea will branch off into your hilum. Again, it'll turn to your left and right primary bronchus. Again, that will eventually branch off into your secondary bronchus, your tertiary bronchus, and then it gets into your bronchioles, your terminal bronchioles, and then your respiratory bronchioles, your alveolar ducts, and then finally your alveoli. And again, if we look at your lung, you probably have about 300 million alveoli inside of that lung structure. So there you have it. That is your respiratory system. Again, quick review. Basically what we've done is we've gone through your nares, through your nasal cavity, to your pharynx, through your larynx, through your trachea, and then we eventually broke off at the hilum, and we broke off into your primary bronchus, which went through all these different divisions, eventually to your lung tissue, where we eventually broke off into your alveolar ducts, into your individual alveoli. And again, basically what you're trying to do as a goal is to bring in oxygenated air and then get rid of deoxygenated air in terms of our CO2 waste product that we are producing. Well, that completes our lesson for today. I hope this was a helpful podcast, and until next time, remember, keep studying anatomy and physiology.